I was 53 years old, lying flat on a hospital bed in Vancouver General, when my son-in-law Nathan walked in and dropped a manila envelope onto my chest. Not on the bedside table. Not handed to me gently. Dropped. Right onto the bandages covering the place where, less than 18 hours earlier, a surgeon had removed part of my bone marrow to save his younger brother's life. I remember the sound it made. That soft papery thud against the hospital gown. "What is this?" I asked. My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. He crossed his arms and leaned against the doorframe like he owned the room. "Divorce papers, for Claire, she already knows." Behind him, his mother Georgette stepped in. She was wearing a blazer, to a hospital. She looked around the room the way people look around a hotel they've decided isn't quite up to their standards, and then she smiled at me. It wasn't a warm smile. "We appreciate everything you've done," she said. "We really do." I just stared at her. My daughter Claire was not in that room. The woman I had given bone marrow for. Not for Nathan, not for Georgette, but for Claire's sake, because she'd begged me with tears running down her face, and told me Liam was going to die without a match. Claire was not in that room. I want to tell you this story properly, because there are parts of it I still have to force myself to remember. But I also want you to understand that what happened in that hospital room was not the worst moment. The worst moment had come much earlier, years before. On the day I first said yes. Claire was 31 when she married Nathan Holt. He came from money. Old Alberta oil money that had been quietly reinvested into real estate and private equity over 2 generations. So it didn't smell like oil anymore. It just smelled like privilege. He was handsome in that particular way that makes you not quite trust a person. Very straight teeth. Very steady eye contact. I tried to like him. I genuinely did. My husband Gerald had passed 4 years before the wedding, and Claire was my only child. And I suppose I wanted her happiness badly enough that I was willing to overlook the ways Nathan made me uneasy. The way he'd finish her sentences. The way he'd look at his phone when she was talking. The small patient corrections he made in public. Her pronunciation of a word, her memory of a date. Always framed as affection. Always with a little laugh. But Claire loved him. Or she's loved who she thought he was. And I was just her mother, 50 years old and living alone in my townhouse in North Vancouver. And what did I know? The wedding was at a vineyard in the Okanagan. "Beautiful," I cried, which I suspect Nathan found embarrassing. For 2 years things looked fine on the surface. They bought a house in West Vancouver. Claire was working as a physiotherapist. Nathan was doing whatever it is people like Nathan do. Meetings, calls, flights to Toronto and back. I saw my daughter for Sunday dinners when she could manage it, and I told myself the distance between us was just what happened when children grew up and built their own lives. Then Nathan's younger brother Liam was diagnosed with aplastic anemia. I need to explain what aplastic anemia is, because I didn't know when Claire first told me, and understanding it matters for everything that came after. Aplastic anemia is a condition where the bone marrow stops producing enough blood cells. It can come on gradually or all at once. In severe cases, it is life-threatening. The most effective treatment is a bone marrow transplant from a compatible donor, ideally a sibling, but siblings are only a match about 25% of the time. When they're not, the search goes to the National Registry, to unrelated donors, to anyone whose tissue type happens to line up correctly with the patient's. Liam and Nathan were not a match. I learned this later. What I knew at the time was that Claire called me on a Tuesday evening. In March, crying so hard I could barely understand her, telling me that Liam was very sick, and that they were struggling to find a donor, and that the doctors had said family members of the patient's spouse were sometimes tested, as a long shot, and would I be willing to come in and be tested? Of course, I said. I didn't even hesitate. I want to be clear about something. I did not do this for Nathan. I did not do it for Georgette, who had never once invited me to a family dinner in 2 years of marriage. I did it because Liam was 26 years old. Because he had a girlfriend and a border collie and a half-finished architecture degree. And because my daughter was weeping on the phone, and I could not bear to say no to her. Until went in to be tested. The blood work came back. The preliminary markers looked promising. Over the following weeks, there was more testing, HLA typing, a full compatibility workup, and eventually the transplant coordinator at Vancouver General called me and told me I was a strong match. I remember sitting down very slow after that call. I was a match. What followed was months of preparation, consultations with the transplant team, a medical ethics review, because I was donating for a specific recipient rather than through the general registry. Psychological evaluation, blood tests every few weeks to monitor my health. I was given detailed information about the procedure, a peripheral blood stem cell collection, which involved daily injections of a drug called filgrastim, 4-5 days beforehand to stimulate my marrow, followed by a process called apheresis where blood is drawn out, the stem cells are separated, and the remaining blood is returned to you. It is not a minor thing. The filgrastim injections cause bone pain, deep, aching pain in your hips and spine and sternum, the kind of pain that wakes you up at 3 in the morning and makes you lie very still and breathe carefully. I was warned about this. I told myself I could manage it. I did not tell Claire about the pain. She would have felt guilty. During those months, Nathan was attentive. That is the word I keep coming back to. Attentive. He called me regularly. He sent flowers after my consultations. He told me I was the most remarkable woman he'd ever met outside of his own family, and he said it with those steady eyes and that straight smile, and I thought, maybe I misjudged him. Maybe he is genuinely grateful. Georgette came to one of my pre-procedure appointments. She sat in the waiting room and held my hand while we waited, and she told me I was saving her son's life and that she would never forget it. I believed her. I was 53 years old and I believed her, and I do not forgive myself easily for that even now. The collection procedure was scheduled for a Thursday. I went in the morning with Claire, who held my hand during the apheresis, and brought me Tim Hortons afterward and sat beside me, while the technicians processed everything. It took several hours. By the end of it I was tired in a way I hadn't felt since the months after Gerald died, a bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. They admitted me overnight for observation, standard protocol for donors of my age. Claire stayed until visiting hours ended. She kissed my forehead and told me she loved me, and that I was the best mother in the world, and I told her to go home and get some rest. She had dark circles under her eyes that had been there for weeks. I slept. In the morning, a doctor came in who I hadn't met before. She introduced herself as Dr. Anand, and she was from the transplant team, and she had a manner about her, very careful, very measured, that made me sit up straighter even before she said a word. Mrs. Donahue, she said, I need to speak with you something that was discovered during final pre-transplant verification. I waited. During the final cross-match between your stem cells and Liam Holt's tissue profile, the lab identified a significant incompatibility that was not present in the earlier testing. This is rare, but it does occur. The incompatibility means the transplant cannot proceed as planned. The risk of severe graft versus host disease would be too high. I stared at her. What does that mean? It means Liam cannot receive your stem cells. The room got very quiet. I could hear the ventilation system. Someone in the hallway laughing at something. Then what happens to what was collected? My cells? Dr. Anand was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Donahue, I have to tell you something, and I want you to hear it fully before you respond. Upon discovering the incompatibility, our team reviewed the full documentation around your donation. Some irregularities were found in the compatibility documentation that was submitted in the initial workup. We've referred the matter to our compliance office and to the RCMP. I heard the word RCMP and I thought I'd misunderstood her. I'm sorry, the RCMP? We believe the initial compatibility documents were fraudulently altered. The ventilation system. The laughing in the hallway. Someone falsified the records to make it appear you were a match when the full picture was more complicated than it seemed. We don't yet know who is responsible, but the transplant cannot proceed, and you should know that your stem cells, because you consented to donation for a designated recipient who cannot receive them, have been offered to the National Registry match list to another patient who is compatible and in critical need. I didn't say anything for a long time. Another patient, I finally said. A young woman in Calgary, 22 years old. She's been waiting 14 months. I looked out the window. It was raining the way it rains in Vancouver in November, not dramatically, just persistently, a gray patience settling over everything. Okay, I said, okay, let it go to her. It was about 2 hours after Dr. Anand left that Nathan and Georgette arrived. I had not slept again. I was sitting up in the bed, still in the hospital gown, the IV line still in my arm, running through the conversation with Dr. Anand and trying to make the pieces fit together. Fraudulent documents. Initial compatibility. Someone had gone to considerable effort to make me believe I was a match. Or to make me believe Liam needed me specifically. The door opened and Nathan came in, and behind him Georgette, and behind her a woman I had never seen before, who was wearing a very particular kind of diamond solitaire ring on her left hand. Nathan was carrying a manila envelope. He didn't sit down. He dropped the envelope on my chest, and I heard that papery thud, and he said, "Divorce papers, for Claire. She already knows." I looked at the ring on the stranger's hand. I looked at Georgette's blazer. I looked at Nathan's steady eyes. "How long?" I asked. He didn't answer that. He said, "Claire will be well taken care of. The settlement is fair. How long has this been planned?" Georgette made a small sound. Something between a sigh and a laugh. "This really isn't the time or place. You came to my hospital room," I said. My voice had found itself again. "You came to the room where I am lying the day after a medical procedure I underwent for your family. You brought divorce papers. You brought her." I looked at the woman with the ring, "So I will decide what the time and place is." Nathan's jaw tightened. "The documents will need to be signed within." "Get out," I said. "Mrs. Donahue, get out of my room." He looked at Georgette. Something passed between them. Then he set the envelope on the bedside table instead, straightened his jacket, and they left. The woman with the ring gave me one last look before she closed the door behind her. I couldn't read what was in it. I picked up my phone and called Claire. She answered on the second ring, and I could tell immediately that she had been crying for a long time. "Mom," she said. "I know," I said. "I know. Are you somewhere safe right now?" She was at a friend's place in Kitsilano. She'd gone there the night before because Nathan had told her. The night before my procedure, the night before. While I was at home giving myself the last filgrastim injection in my kitchen. He'd told her he wanted a divorce and that there was someone else. She had not told me because she didn't want me to be upset, going into the procedure. My daughter had spent the night sobbing in her friend's spare room, so that I wouldn't be distressed before surgery. And in the morning, her husband had come to the hospital to formalize it. I held the phone and I did not let myself cry, because Claire was already crying enough for both of us and someone needed to be steady. "Listen to me," I said. "I need you to call a lawyer today. Not tomorrow, today, do you understand?" "Mom, I can't even." "Claire, listen to my voice. You are going to call a lawyer today. Write down this name, Susan Kirkwood. She's in Yaletown. I went to university with her. She does family law and she is excellent, and I am going to call her right now and tell her to expect to hear from you. Can you do that?" A long pause. Then, "Yeah, I can do that." "Good. I love you. Come to the hospital when you're ready. Don't rush." I hung up and sat very still for a moment. Then I called Susan Kirkwood. "I want to tell you about the 3 months that followed. Not because they were easy. They weren't. But because they are the part of the story that most people don't see. The part that happens in office buildings and on phone calls and in paperwork. Far from the drama of hospital rooms and dropped envelopes. Susan Kirkwood was exactly as good as I remembered. She met with Claire within 24 hours of my call, and by the end of that first meeting, she had a clear picture of the situation. 2 years of marriage, joint assets including the West Vancouver house and a shared investment account. Claire's career and income. And Nathan's considerably more complex financial picture. Claire had not signed anything. This turned out to be important, because what Susan found, working with a forensic accountant she'd used before, was that in the months leading up to the divorce, in the same months, when I was being prepared as a bone marrow donor, Nathan had been quietly moving assets, restructuring his holdings, shifting things between numbered companies in ways that were legal technically, but were clearly designed to minimize what Claire would receive in a settlement. He had been planning this for a long time. Not weeks. Months. Maybe longer. I sat with that for a while. I thought about the flowers Nathan had sent after my consultations, the phone calls, the steady eyes. I thought about Georgette holding my hand in the waiting room and telling me she would never forget what I was doing. And I thought about the fraudulent compatibility document. The RCMP investigation was ongoing. I was interviewed twice. I was not the target of their inquiry. I was the victim of it. The investigators were focused on who had access to the transplant documentation and who had motive to falsify it. I gave them everything I had, which was mostly a clear account of the timeline, and the names of every person who had been present at, or informed about my various consultations. I will not tell you that I knew for certain what had happened. I still do not know for certain, because the investigation is not fully concluded. What I can tell you is what the investigator told me, carefully and off the record, during our second conversation, that the falsified documents appeared to have been generated using a consulting firm that had connections to the Holt family's corporate network, that someone with considerable resources had manufactured my compatibility with Liam, had made it appear on paper that I was the best possible match in order to bring me into the process. Why have I asked myself times? The most honest answer I can give is this. I think Nathan wanted the divorce arranged before it happened. I think he needed Claire out, needed the marriage closed cleanly so he could move forward with the other woman. And I think, though I have no proof of this and I would never say it in a courtroom, I think having me occupied with the donation process kept me out of the picture. A mother-in-law who is going through months of medical preparation, who is tired and focused on a procedure, is a mother-in-law who is not paying close attention to her daughter's marriage. Whether it was a deliberate strategy or simply a convenient alignment of circumstances, I cannot say. What I can say is that it worked, right up until it didn't. Because the final cross-match failed, the incompatibility surfaced, and in surfacing, it pulled on a thread that unraveled everything else. Claire did not sign the initial divorce papers. This was Susan's first and most important instruction, and Claire followed it exactly. Over the following months, Susan's team built a case that the asset transfers Nathan had made were improper given the timeline, that they constituted dissipation of marital assets during the period he already and that Claire was entitled to a share of the full value of those assets as they existed before the restructuring began. It took 11 months. There was a mediation that failed. There was a second mediation. There were letters between lawyers that I was not privy to but that Claire described as pretty pointed. Nathan hired a very expensive firm in downtown Vancouver that specialized in exactly this kind of case, and for a while it seemed like his resources would simply outlast ours. But Susan was better than expensive, and the forensic accountant was meticulous. And the RCMP investigation, while focused on the transplant fraud rather than the divorce, cast a shadow over Nathan's credibility that his lawyers could not entirely manage. In the end, Claire received the West Vancouver house, bought at a value assessed before the transfers, and a settlement that reflected the full marital estate. She did not get everything. Nobody gets everything, but she got enough to start over with a foundation under her feet, which is what Susan had promised from the beginning. The woman with the ring, her name was Sabrina, I eventually learned, married Nathan 3 months after the divorce was finalized. They live in Calgary now, which I find mildly ironic given that the young woman who received my stem cells is also in Calgary, and is by all accounts doing well. I think about that sometimes. A 22-year-old woman in Calgary, who has never heard of me, who is alive and building her life, who got something meant for someone else and made it count. There is something in that which I find more comforting than I expected. Liam, for what it's worth, did eventually find a match through the National Registry. It took 8 months. He's finished his architecture degree. I don't know if he knew about the falsified documents. I don't know how much he knew about any of it. And I have made peace with the fact that I probably never will. Georgette sent me a card at Christmas that first year. Just a card. No letter, no explanation, no acknowledgement of what had happened in that hospital room. A generic card with a cardinal on the front and a printed message inside. She had signed it in her own handwriting. That was all. I looked at the cardinal for a long time. Then I threw the card away and opened a bottle of wine that my neighbor Phyllis had given me. And I sat in my kitchen in North Vancouver, and I thought about Gerald, who had been gone 5 years by then, and who I still talk to sometimes when nobody is listening. I thought about the version of this story where I had hesitated in March, where I had said, I need time to think about this, where I had asked more questions. I thought about the version where I had been paying closer attention, but I also thought about the 22-year-old in Calgary, and I could not make myself wish it had gone differently, even knowing everything I know. That is the strange thing about this kind of wound. It doesn't heal the way you expect it to. It doesn't leave a clean scar. What it leaves is something more complicated. An understanding of your own capacity that you didn't have before. And a knowledge of what other people are capable of, that you would rather not carry. And, somewhere underneath all of that, if you are lucky, a small stubborn conviction that what you chose to do was still worth doing. I chose to help. That choice was used against me. And somewhere in Calgary a young woman is breathing, and her bone marrow is making blood cells, and she doesn't know my name. I find I'm all right with that. Claire is renting an apartment in Mount Pleasant now, 2 blocks from a bakery she loves. She has a tabby cat named after Gerald. She didn't tell me that's why she named him that, but I know. She is seeing someone new, very carefully the way you do after something like this. She calls me on Sundays. Last month she asked me quietly if I regretted it. The donation, all of it. I thought about the filgrastim injections at 3 in the morning. I thought about the papery thud of the envelope on my chest. I thought about Georgette's blazer and Nathan's straight teeth and the look on the face of the woman with the ring. Then I thought about Dr. Anand saying a young woman in Calgary, 22 years old, she's been waiting 14 months. No, I told Claire. I don't regret it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I don't know how you do that. Yes you do, I said. You did the same thing. You spent the whole night crying so I wouldn't worry before my procedure. That's the same thing. She laughed, a little wet around the edges. That's completely different. It really isn't. We stayed on the phone a while longer after that, not talking about anything important. Just staying on the line. The way you do when the important things have already been said and what you need now is just the sound of another person being there. That's enough, I think. Sometimes that is exactly enough.